My name is Tom Mustillo, and I am co-chair of this panel, this roundtable. And I'm from the University of Notre Dame in the US, and I edit the Political Data Yearbook, published by the ECPR. I'm glad to see the room, kind of having surpassed, like I mentioned, the threshold of more audience members than panelists. So we're delighted you took this last session on the conference schedule to come here. And very good. So the title of our session is Developing an Ecosystem of Fair, Linked, and Open Data in and Beyond Political Science. I guess in the spirit of kind of discussion and exchange, let me just invite my co-panelists here to kind of give one breath introductions.
So, hi everyone, I'm Lizzie Brophy. I'm actually a publisher with Wiley. I manage the ECPR, which is obviously the flagship title of ECPR, as well as a number of other political science, policy, public administration, and law titles, both in Europe and in the US. So, but my background is in archaeology.
Hi, I'm Hajo. I'm at the University of Vienna, and I'm a communication scientist by training, research on political communication, and in the last years became quite involved in building up the European-wide data infrastructure we'll talk about today, and which we hopefully will be hosting in Austria. Thanks.
Very good, thanks. Linda.
Hello, my name is Basile. I work as a researcher at the University of Siena, where we coordinate several European projects. I had practical experience on drafting data management plans, and since October 2021, I am also co-editor at the European Political Science Journal, which is a journal of the ECPR.
Thank you. My name is Natalie Meyers. I am a faculty member in the Lucy Family Institute for Data and Society at the University of Notre Dame, where Tom is a faculty member. And today I'm mostly here in my capacity as a member of the International Science Council's Committee on Data, and in specific, its Data Interoperability Working Group. And through that organization and the GoFair International Office, I'll share some resources with you available to all researchers and disciplinary societies for making their research more fair.
Hello, my name is Eike Rinke. I'm at the University of Leeds. I'm a lecturer in politics and media there. And also, and that's the reason for me being on this panel, I think at this point now, a long-term proponent or advocate, you could also say, for all things open scholarship and open science and the social sciences. That's, I think, the position I will speak from to you today. That also means that I think I'm the least fair literate person on the panel. I would think so. I expect to learn quite a bit, but yeah, I'll give you my take on how I see fair data as a part of the wider open scholarship ecology.
Excellent. And I published edited a wonderful symposium at PS on related themes. And then also let's give my co-chairs kind of an opportunity to say,
yeah, hello everybody. I'm lecturer in Department of Politics at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg, Germany. And I'm here as co-editor with Tom, and also with Mr. Cohen, who can be here as co-editor of the PDY, and I'm here on a personal side as comparativist, really interested in data infrastructure.
Holger.
Hi, I'm Holger. I'm Döring. I'm interim head at the Research Institute in Cologne. And so I work on two data projects, part project artifacts, and for this I have collaborated with Tom, and we are seeking kind of to institutionalize, to combine these things. So I'm just eager to follow what we are all going to do for the next 5 years.
Thank you guys. Well, so I'll just give a couple words of introduction and then kind of get the discussion moving, and it will include the audience kind of in the last segment. So I guess I would like to start by just motivating with a particular conversation, and we could use it or not as we go forward. But So I edited the political data yearbook and this online facing political data yearbook called PDY Interactive. This is a publication of Wiley and the European Consortium of Political Research. And, you know, it contains very basic, kind of high value, low status kind of data on governments, elections, and parties. We are, you know, not alone in publishing that kind of data. HarlGov, KuGov, you know, there's obviously quite a lot of sources for these things. But, you know, it's distinctive in a way. It's been around for a long time, decades. We have kind of a cadre of country authors every year kind of plugged in and delivering us intel on the party systems and politics of the various countries. Right? Bulgarians telling us about what's happening in Bulgaria, for example. 37 of these cases, and it's hosted by ECPR, so it's institutionalized in a way. Okay, so the PDYs, in some of those senses, make it distinctive. And we are thinking about a redevelopment of it. Many of you might not have encountered it, maybe because you haven't found it useful or something. And we want to become sort of a valuable resource, kind of extending beyond the base that, you know, many people who already download from our research. So, but the problem is that I confront, so just problematizing sort of this conversation, the problem that I myself face, and I'm with Eike, I'm no expert either on fair data, is like how to go about this redevelopment, how to take the thing we have and to make it kind of future-proof, to upgrade it and improve it in ways that would make it a real kind of resource. But in doing so, and facing that challenge, I find myself, as various people here kind of know already, kind of sort of paralyzed. Like, what should we do first? How do we design this thing? How do we get moving? So why paralysis? Why am I paralyzed? Well, it's because the world is so dynamic and changing, right? We are going to make some decisions now, but at the same time, as you look around, you know, norms are changing and regulations, new ones are emergent and starting to bind us. Technologies are changing. There's all kinds of kind of unsettled terrain with respect to how to store data and again, a terrain I don't know much about. Triples versus JSON, things like that. If that's someone else's expertise there to elaborate. You know, you look around in adjacent disciplines, psychology is sort of prominent, where a recent, you know, credibility crisis has led to a pretty big advances on some of the themes we're talking about here today. There's new ethics, not only about openness and transparency, but also about inclusion and credit giving, right, to the people, the Bulgarians and everyone else who's contributed to this data resource. And then there's new institutions, you know, Hajo, for example, with Meta, is innovating with, of course, a wide group of people to institutionalize this future we're trying to get ready for. So that's sort of like the source of my paralysis. What should we do given all this? I read recently a quote by a computer scientist working now in the private sector, Gavin Mendel-Gleeson. He declared that, quote, distributed, interoperable, well-defined data is literally the most central problem for the current and near future human economy. Distributed, so PDYI and all the other data sets and data sources out there. Interoperable, able to link with each other and build new resources from the existing resources. And well-defined, right? So structured and documented and replicable and sourceable and all of that. He was thinking of the semantic web and kind of criticizing the failure for it to kind of come into being, right? The failure to live up to its promises. I don't know how long ago. So it seemed like an interesting, I like that problem. It seems to embody the way at a very high level, of course, what we face here. So in light of this, what do we do? It seems to me that it's not kind of non-obvious or not easy. So our purpose here is kind of modest. It's to broaden and amplify the conversation on this kind of theme. To get colleagues thinking, you who are maybe working on this or not, but this panel of people who are thinking about at least bits and pieces of the challenge, to get people thinking and talking about these issues so that we can normalize and routinize and bring rigor and purpose to this future. I can't help but notice, I'm sure you can't either, that we're not the only ones doing this. There was a panel earlier in the week on ethics and data. Lizzie and Raul were on that panel. There was a panel on big data with a full auditorium very early. I think maybe the first panel of the conference with a full room on big data and replication and sourcing and all the rest was prominent there. So there's a lot of conversation about this. I'd like to note that we're talking about new norms and new developments and new directions, and I have to emphasize that we invite critical perspectives, right? It's not uncontroversial. It can be done well or done poorly. It involves trade-offs and particular proposals you might hear. So let's engage with those critical perspectives as well. So today we have a discussion from a diverse kind of perspectives to bear on this question. How and what do we move into this new world with data? For me, Raul and Michelangelo, the PDYI is just kind of a rhetorical device to motivate this. There's other data, there's other data types. The audience is diverse in this room. So within and beyond this discipline, there's lots of voices that are potentially in play. So let's get started. What we're going to do is kind of do this in rounds. We'll have an opening round of kind of Q&A with the panel here, and then we'll have another block, round 2, for them to react to each other. And then we'll have a last round for the audience to engage as well, with questions and answers from the panel. Okay, so Eike, I'd like to begin with you. Political scientists think broadly about data, text as data, observational data of all sorts, graphic data, speech, image as data, and whatnot. Moreover, we have lots of traditions for standardizing data for these various types. Could you comment on these themes, on what it means to standardize data? How does it pertain to the diversity of data that we use? How can we standardize across many qualitative and quantitative traditions that we embody? Should we be concerned or skeptical of any of these initiatives to standardize? And then maybe most importantly, how would standardization enable innovation and innovative methods of research at a scale that is kind of broader than we currently find in this?
Thanks, Tom. First of all, for inviting me again. I don't know if you want to pull up lots of important questions. So first of all, let me say, I don't hope you really expect a conclusive answer from me to all these massive questions, but I'll give you my take on them in just a second. However, before that, I just wanted to, more generally perhaps, remind ourselves now that we're all sitting in this room, we're all concerning ourselves with questions around fair data, where are we going, should we be doing this, and so on. I want to remind us, first of all, and I hope that is useful, you can click for more, of where we come from, right? Because I think that's important too. And this is an article that I just stumbled upon quite recently in my own work. This is just has had its 20th anniversary on Leuphana. You can click again to highlight this part on there. It's an exchange between Leuphana and Klaus Amgeon, in which Leibniz responds to Armin Georg and says, well, that the criticism Armin Georg has leveled against my work is exactly the kind of thing that I wished for when I shared the data underlying my book Patterns of Democracy in an appendix of the book. And then if you click once more in the note, he says he repeats the offer to share his full data set as well. He says that I can send my data either in hard copy form or as an email attachment to any researcher who would like to use them. Please write to Arndt Leibniz, etc., or just send him a letter to get his data. And that's 20 years ago only. I mean, perhaps, of course, a lot of things happened in those 20 years, but then again, it's not too far away, right? It's still an important point of reference, that sort of work, and it was based on that sort of underlying sort of method of exchanging data, or not, right? It's quite cumbersome compared to the kind of access to data we can draw on today. So I want us to celebrate, first of all, the distance we've made in terms of data sharing since the beginning, the early noughties. So click once more. So that's a massive discovery for me. Again, blew my mind when I saw that, wow, this is in the 2000s and we're still sending letters and hard copies. So yeah, but I want to use my presence here to make an argument for us, sort of to plea for us to make sure that our next moves in that space around sharing data, making it standardized and openly accessible, ensures that that we are not being as much about being transparent about the data underlying our work as much as we are thinking about being positively inclusive, both across methodologies, different types of methodologies, and across audiences, as I would say. Across methodologies, first of all, here's an example. Yeah, you can click again. So this is an example from a neighboring discipline, from sociology, of an archive that perhaps not many of you will be familiar with, called the Timescapes Archive for Qualitative Longitudinal Data. So an incredibly interesting project that's hosted at Leeds, where my qualitative sociologist colleagues there store qualitative data in what they attempt to be as standardized a form as possible. Right? And I think that sort of work is incredibly important and should be on our radar more when we, as perhaps mainstream political scientists, perhaps thinking often in a quantitative frame of mind, think about issues around combining, interlinking, cross-referencing, and sharing our data sets. So that's something we need to be inclusive of. If you can click one more, there's of course a more political science example there as well. The qualitative data repository hosted at Syracuse is another important example that I think we need to be mindful of when we have these conversations as today, to think about how we bring them in, how can we have a conversation involving the people behind those kinds of projects and using the kinds of methodologies they've been developed for. So one more. But also I think we need to think positively about being inclusive towards various audiences, and to think hard about who are we trying to reach with our data. Right? Of course, with Leibniz, it's fairly clear it's a fellow political scientist whom he's happy to share his data with. But I think we will do well if we think larger than that, and in a larger frame of mind, and try to think about bringing in wider audiences through means of sharing our data and engaging the public more. Okay, so here's just two quick examples of how that potentially could be done. This is a Shiny app that comes along with one of our recent papers, perhaps not the most publicly accessible or easily understandable way of accessing the data underlying our study, but it's one step forward, right? You can access that data, play around with it, generate graphs interactively just by using the web browser and going to that site. And then one more. That's another example from my own work where we document quite clearly, I hope, how we web scraped a number of websites and sort of that moving average graph that time series tracks quite closely for anyone who wants to know about this. How many items we collected from different websites, right, on a given day in our study period. So those are two examples of bringing in wider audiences, which I think is important. Now to your questions, the actual question, 2 minutes. Yeah, I mean, what standardizing data, as I hope you may suspect that I can't give you the comprehensive answer to that, but I do want to emphasize that, of course, we do have a lot of existing knowledge in that area in our field, right? We do have a long and strong tradition of dealing with a multiplicity of data types in political science. But however, I think we yet need to figure out precisely what standardizing across those different data types really means, and how we can make sure that those different rich sources and traditions can be connected in a way that's useful for everyone, including the broader public, as I just said. So there are going to need to be multiple conversations and solutions for us to find, and a lot of translational work across different methodologies will need to happen, absolutely. And I think we're not having enough of those conversations yet. How can we standardize? Well, again, I think we need to create stable fora for that sort of conversation. We're having a one-off event here right now, which is absolutely great and well taken. But I think we need to institutionalize that sort of conversation more. We need to think about how we can perhaps even build a fair data community that's inclusive in nature within political science as well. And finally, how would standardization enable innovative mixed data research designs at a larger scale? Well, based on my own theoretical perspective, perhaps, I tend to take a discursive point of view on this, and will just want to say that in an ideal world, standardization will enable greater visibility, engagement, again, conversations and cooperations across boundaries that previously were just impervious to different fields and methodologies. So that's a fairly abstract answer, I know that, but I think we will need to think hard about how we can enable those sort of exchanges across different methodologies and to further innovative mixed methods research design thinking in our disciplines. And what precisely that could mean, I'm happy to talk about more in our interactions. But yeah, that's me for the moment.
Exactly, and that's perfectly right for the getting started here. I saw Hajo taking notes, and you might have a follow-up or something like that. So anyway, there we are. Okay, so Natalie, thank you. Natalie, your expertise lies in thinking about the new norms and methods for unleashing the potential for unstandardized data, and maybe unstandardized data, I don't know, you can tell us. So can you just briefly tell us, first of all, what are fair data standards? Consider for a moment, I think, all the diverse forms of data, the expansion and inclusion that Eike referred to there. What would it mean for an individual researcher doing interviews, ethnographies, and whatnot to verify their data? And what are the benefits to this community of political scientists of doing so?
I'd be happy to take that up. I did share some slides. If it's easy to bring them up, that'd be great. They're post-pended with NKM. I think what's fun about answering this question, you ask, first, can I briefly describe what the FAIR standards are? The first myth to dispel is that the FAIR principles are standards. They're not standards, but they might invoke, for example, ISO standards for identifiers and more in their implementation. The FAIR data principles were first published in 2016 as the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management and Stewardship. They were published in the journal Scientific Data, and the author's intent was to provide guidelines to improve the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse of digital assets. That probably sounds pretty familiar when we look at the Leuphana example. The principles emphasize machine actionability, the capacity of a computational system to find, access, interoperate, and reuse data with none or minimal human intervention, because humans increasingly rely on computational support to deal with data as a result of the increase in volume, complexity, and creation speed of the data we use, not just in political science, but in journalism, in physics, in math, in a variety of disciplines and enterprises. So when we think, what are the FAIR principles? They are guidelines to help us make data more findable, more accessible. Does it have a license? Can you read it? Can your software read it? Make your data interoperable. Can your software use it and my software? Can my system find it? Can your system find it? And most importantly, reusable. Create a way for our digital assets to be reusable. That hopefully is a little bit more expedient than email the author. But what I think is really terrific is that Elke mentioned Leibniz and his invitation that he wanted to share his data and for people to write to him at UC San Diego. If you'd advance to the next slide. When the FAIR principles were authored in 2016, one of the things that happened soon after was the creation of the Go FAIR International Office. And interestingly, in the Go FAIR International Office, you can find instructions on how to create a Go FAIR office for your own country or your own region. In the United States, the US Go FAIR office is at none other than UC San Diego, Leiphardt's home, at the San Diego Supercomputing Center under the guidance of Christine Kirkpatrick. I'm a team member in that office, and our job in the Go FAIR office in the US is to support researchers like Tom, which is why I'm here, and their disciplines in making their data and their software more fair. Why is it at the San Diego Supercomputing Center? Because computational reuse of data can mean keeping your data close to compute. Now let's think. Tom asked us, consider for a moment the diverse types of data we encounter and what would it mean for an individual researcher doing interviews or ethnography in Bulgaria, or PIs of the Party Manifestos Project, or to the editors of the PDY to verify their data. And what I would say is that a discipline can define that first step as the creation of a FAIR implementation profile. What does it mean for the Political Data Yearbook Interactive to go FAIR? What persistent identifiers are they going to choose for people, places, dates, times, parties? And as they define those, it begins to structure what their metadata looks like. And then their metadata paired with their data can continue to make that data more reusable, make that data more eminently reusable, and ideally interoperable by computer systems outside your discipline or outside your lab. Finally, Tom asks us, what are the benefits? Reusability will accelerate research and provide relevant content not only for research and lab work, but also for you as educators and teaching the next generation of political scientists. Open data creates a landscape of things you can cite, share, and use in education as well as in disciplinary work. And why does it matter that a machine can find our data? If you move to the next slide, you'll see the way that some disciplines I highlight here, including top factor in publishing, take steps to make it so that machines can find data in journals, in publishers' entire platforms, in society's entire publishing output, whether that be data output or articles, conference proceedings, conference posters, anything can become FAIR, including qualitative or quantitative data. And your software, that's really important. The FAIR principles are for software as well as data, humans as well as machines. So what does it matter that a machine can find our data? It means the software we write or reuse can know not only where a data set is, but what the license is for using it, what its metadata is, and ultimately help you decide, is this something I want to intersect with my own hypothesis or my own data set to answer a question that's important to me and my colleagues or my students, so that we can tackle problems together. So I'm really glad to be here. On the list of disciplinary examples, you'll see from the American Geophysical Union, the Enabling Fair Data Project. It's one example of how a disciplinary society got funding, in this case from Arnold Foundation, to bring together a broad spectrum of people to make data fair within a single disciplinary society. In this case of about 60,000 members. You'll see an example for a tiny hackathon held in DC that I co-organized. It was for math and physical sciences, high energy physicists, light source data researchers, and materials scientists. And what they did was share software and practices and learn together from bioinformaticians and other disciplines how they went there. And finally, you might have heard of the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. That group was started, I think, in 2017. And their mandate, coming out of the reproducibility crisis that Tom referenced, was to tackle the things that made their discipline not very reproducible. And the SIPS group is the way they continue to this day to have annual conferences about how to improve reproducibility in psych science. And finally, top factor is a way for journals to articulate where along the FAIR principles your journal is in terms of what it requires from authors, from peer reviewers and editors, and how they work together to look at the data and software that might accompany an article. So that's it for me. I'm keen to hear from the rest of you.
No, that's great, Natalie. And that example seems to be an illustration of society, kind of in response to Eike's point about taking this one-off and institutionalizing it in some way. Maybe Meta is a vehicle for that kind of thing as well. Great. So next, I'd like to turn to you, Lizzie, as a publisher who works with ECPR, and also, as you noted, with a wide variety of other journals and other disciplines. You see, I think, some of these emerging norms and opportunities taking shape within your industry. So from your perch as a publisher, can you describe how publishing is changing as publics and scholars and computers demand more from the investments they're making in data and in science? How are these demands being incorporated into scholarly publishing? And what can we as a community of productivity as a discipline do to kind of accompany you as a publisher or partner in these efforts?
Yeah, so again, thank you for having come to you here today, particularly as the publisher. Obviously your questions are going to be questions, so I'm going to go through and answer them one by one. So if you move to the first slide, because you talk about the investments. And this is a nice simplified version of how the research landscape looks right now. I'm sure some of you are seeing that funding is increasing and are saying, where? How? Who's getting that? There is a lot of funding out there if we're talking in generalities. And we can see that there's a lot of vested interest in research and researchers. And it goes to a lot of different areas. And this is about kind of showing you, again, how complex it is and how much there is a vested interest in research, in the output, and in what happens next. So from a publishing perspective, we're really seeing open data as being kind of part of this much wider kind of group of open research. So if we go to the next slide, looking at open research as a whole, you might sometimes hear it called open science. I've had too many discussions with editors telling me that social science and humanities journals don't need science for me to really go into that. So it's open research in this forum. And as you can see, so in relation to this, it's open access, open data, and open practices. And at the moment, we're definitely in the open access phase. That is about making those investments in science and data available. And this is being driven by funders, institutions, and governments. And this is something that the transformational agreements you might have heard of are really about. And publishers are being held accountable in order to get content published as soon as possible, open access. Of course, open data is fitting inside of this, about making the material accessible and as accessible as possible. And again, about trying to create the support for that. And I think that is one of the big, kind of areas we're at. It's like, there are repositories, there are some really obvious repositories for some subjects, less obvious for some others. And again, I've actually had people come up to me at this conference and say, well, I have qualitative research, so I don't really need to worry about open data. And it's like, well, you do. And then finally, there's open practices, which is kind of about pulling back the curtain, really. We're talking about things like transparent peer review, pre-registered reports, making it really clear what's going on kind of behind publishing, behind data, behind everything. So how are these kind of being incorporated into scholarship publishing? I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about open access because that's not what this is about. So if you go to the next slide, I've got some of the things that are happening at the moment. Data availability statements are becoming more and more common, even mandatory. Even if you don't have data to share, a lot of journals now, a lot of publishers are saying you still need to state that in relation to your research. The data citation guidelines, so 4-11, that is something that Wiley is signed to. I think the majority of major publishers have. So it's about being able to cite that data so then people can continue to find it through the main output, which is still the research article. We've got other things such as the open science badges, which some people really love, and it can be a great way to just indicate very quickly on an article if this is going to have data available for you. And then, of course, there's developing the opportunities that open practices links really closely to this with the idea of transparent peer review, for example, peer review of data itself. And of course, teaming up with platforms, Figshare, etc., to try to find ways to support that. Obviously, I think one of the biggest things, which of course has been exacerbated by the last 2 years, is also that publishing is definitely focusing even more on making platforms digital, from the research article to the data, etc. There are still journals that are formatted like they were back in the 70s, and very simply, journals don't need such big margins anymore because we can print a lot in a really short amount of time, or nobody's reading it in print anyway. So, it might seem really obvious, but about being able to have a research article and any supporting information, any data, readable on a personal device, it seems really obvious, but it's still something that needs to be developed and moved on for. And again, open data is an internet-based approach. It is an internet-based thing. And then streamlining those workflows. And then finally, what can we do as a community? What can you do as a community of scholars to prepare for the future? It's really important to know that in the current state, the community is not in the same place at all. Some of this is geographic. So, for example, and I'm not going to name any names, but my experience is Europe is very pro-open access, but the US is more pro-open data. And in fact, I manage a journal where your data being available is mandatory, but they don't think there's a future for open access. Yeah, I know. So so there are these contradictions that are coming up. And again, there's been a disparity just in the conversations I had at this conference with different people. So, there is a big disparity about what's going on. People are not in the same place. Having said that, this is my 6th EPR conference. And having seen how, 6 years ago, it was a lot of people were like, I cannot make my data free, absolutely not. To now being like, yeah, this is something I need to engage with. Look at all the data sessions that have been, it's really good. So, thinking about preparing for the future, I'd say that, what maybe the community needs to do is to start engaging with these aspects, through things such as this, and recognizing that we're living in a digital world. Where this is important, this does relate to you, whether you are a quantitative or a qualitative researcher. And I think also for some, and let's emphasize some, it's about understanding that they can't keep doing things the way they did. How the way research was produced and consumed in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 40s is not how it is now. And one of the biggest challenges we have is persuading editors that they should have data statements, that they should have a data policy, that they need to have guidelines around this. So it's really about, and I think one of the important things is that they maybe not hear it from us, but they potentially will hear it from you, they will hear it from the community. If the community says, I need you to do this, to engage with this, then that is one of the best ways for us to be able to move forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lizzie. I appreciate that perspective. So many questions. Okay, let's see. Hajo. Eike, Natalie, and Lizzie, they spoke about opportunities and norms that have emerged in the last decade around standardization, fair data, open science. You are a leader of this monitoring electoral democracies project, MEDEC, which aspires to build, if I understand it correctly, a coordinated body around discipline's efforts to develop open, linkable, shared data. Can you just tell us, to start out with, some of the goals of MEDEC? Explain why they're important, maybe briefly, of course. Explain how we, as political scientists, can use MEDEC to overcome sort of the collective action problems that we face that seem kind of intrinsic to these efforts. And then describe how you think MEDEC relatedly might work with like other data producers and data, other bodies, including the professional associations. You're on. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, first of all, again, for inviting me to the panel. That's great. And before I'm telling you a bit more about MEDEC, I should say this is a very exciting moment to start talking about this type of conference and this type of meetings, just because the idea of MEDEC has been around for 10 years or 12 years and more, and people like Mark Franklin have invested heavily into this in the past. We are now in the lucky situation that we got quite a bit of funding from the Austrian government to actually really start building it now, and we have a commitment from the Austrian government and ministry, but also from other places, that if we really start building this, there's going to be funding available for the next coming years, and that makes it very exciting to now really much more concretely get into discussions about MEDEC. I should also mention that Sylvia Kritzinger, my colleague in Vienna, is just as heavily involved into this as I am. So many of you will know her. MEDEC, so monitoring electoral democracy, is we were trying to build a new European infrastructure that hopefully will enable more, better, highly innovative, comparative research on electoral democracies by building standards and instruments and bringing existing data together to actually do so. I think the entire project, or the idea, started out with the observation that we are producing an enormous amount of data, right? So we have been doing so for the past, we probably increasingly do so at the moment, and there's a lot of projects out there that have data. Many people sitting in the room here that have collected their own data, that are involved in projects, national election studies. Some of these projects are national and heavily institutionalized. Some of these are more loose, comparative projects also in there. So there's a lot out there. What we're missing, and I think that's a fair observation, is what we're missing is a more coordinated effort to bring these projects together and to get more out of these different data collections that we currently do. And I'm sure there's people in the room that have, tried to combine data from different studies to do something new. And we all know how difficult that can be, how labor intensive it can be, if it's at all possible. And what we're striving to do is to say, we don't want to be a project that collects data and imposes standards, but we want to take the projects, take the data owners, take the producers of data that are out there, and bring them together in this new infrastructure and have a conversation about how we actually reach standardization, harmonization, fair sharing, and making accessible, and especially making linkable, i.e. interoperable, the data that we're collecting, and thereby hopefully contribute to much better research in the field. So that's really the aim. It's not building something entirely new, but it's building that really based on the shoulders and taking in the projects and the people and the data that are out there together. Just to give you a quick overview. So what we would love to do is have a conversation about new standards for data collection before projects go into the field. And just as simple as that, to try to combine party codes from different projects. Why do we all use different party codes? Why do we all use different codes for various types of things? I'm a media scholar, so I'm always annoyed by the codes for media outlets. So wouldn't it be simple to say, hey, we're using all the same systems to code this as a very simple example, and I think we can go much beyond that. We would love to work on organized pre, but also post-harmonization of data. So take all the data that's out there and harmonize better, and I know that this project is ongoing. It's involved in the European Voter Project, for instance, that has been inspired to do so. But also think about how can we do that before we go to the field. Then we heard from Eike, I think before, some of you might not be aware of this data. So yeah, there's many data sources out there and many archives and many websites that we're not aware of. So what we'd like to try to do is not have that all in our service and on our websites, but to provide one point where people will be able to find all those different resources in a much more systematic way without needing to use Google and not knowing what you're getting. So having a user-friendly interface to databases, but also to tools, to measurement tools, that could range to question database or content analysis tools, and so on and so forth, would be something we'd love to do, just to make our lives as researchers simpler in terms of looking for, accessing, and then, and that's the next thing, ideally linking those data, right? So we want to try to make sure that if we find data and if we get data from different sources, that ideally an infrastructure can provide the tools to more easily link up those different data sources because they have been harmonized, or because we have tools that can make that harmonization happen. And that also, as other research infrastructures would do, would work on more advanced data visualizations, for instance. There's of course, when you do these types of work, you need to think about training, training opportunities that you would provide to actually do all this work, and thereby hopefully come to a situation where we are building a community and much more, firm community around those who are generating databases. Maybe just very quickly, because I've got much more that I can talk about, but I don't want to take too much time. I think what's important to take away now is that at this stage, we're starting to build the infrastructure based on existing projects that do have a commitment to maybe not all fair principles, but that do have a commitment to data sharing and making that data available. So, I mean, for now, we're obviously working with CSES, CCS, CAP, Maycore. We're working with networks on board device applications. Georg Lutz, a colleague who is involved heavily in this project, is building up a consortium of national election studies. We're working with a consortium of media studies. And so there's a lot of initiatives going on. But it's important that we want to bring those together at this point and then start to enlarge. So in that sense, our hope is that we can make sure that the community is interested in we have some projects on board, but we want to grow and we want to have other projects, and I think we're very open in terms of cooperating with whatever data owners are out there. At this point, it might not be single projects that we're interested in, but maybe more institutionalized or sustained projects. But it's important to know that everyone who comes into the infrastructure will also have a say. So in the governance, there will be a scientific steering board, basically, that consists of these projects, and that collaboratively will try to take decisions on where the infrastructure is going and where things like standardization and so on. That's just a few things. We've again, this has been going for a decade, I think, the first ideas around this. There's a steering committee involving Gothenburg and Lausanne and Sciences Po and others. We are now, with the finances that we have, really taking first steps towards building this. The aim is to submit a proposal to the European Strategic Forum for Research Infrastructures, the ESPRI Forum, by the end of 24, early 25. And we will be doing a lot of groundwork to actually get it going. So that's it.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, we'll come back to this. Excellent. So, Linda, having heard all this, and given your role, your perch as the editor of the professional journal of the association, and then also as I've learned, subsequently about your own experience with data and data planning and data management. I guess I'd like you to reflect a little bit about kind of whether our discipline is kind of ready for these initiatives. How can we become more ready? What are the obstacles? And some possible solutions, perhaps, of cultivating participation in competency in these things that you've heard, many of them, of course. You're on.
So I will divide my answer, my reply in my role as a researcher and my role as an editor, because different things. First of all, you ask me, are we ready? I'll say yes and no. But the good news is that there have been a lot of improvements over here. I'll say and explain my point in a while. In terms of obstacles that I see as a researcher, we could say in an acronym, so we can remind, also because I don't have slides, so I need to rely on shortcuts. The CAR, knowledge, awareness, and rewards. As for knowledge, you have mentioned about open data, but it requires data management skills to make the data open. So someone who cleans the data, someone who takes care of code books, metadata, and it's something that is not so straightforward. So what I see is there is a kind of lack of knowledge, and I'll tell you very briefly my experience when I had to draft my first data management plan. It was 2015, and as you mentioned before, the FAIR guidelines were published 1 year later. So I was so lucky because of the Open Research Data Pilot, which was launched by the European Commission. We had the University of Siena project we were coordinating, and said we had to produce something on fair data without guidelines on fair data. So I went back to my old files, and the first draft was terrible, but it was accepted, so no problem. But then the subsequent updates were much better thanks to the guidelines that were published after 2016. So there is still room for improvement, and also knowledge about the different types of data. We have heard so far a lot about qualitative data, quantitative data. Each data has different requirements. There is not a one-size-fits-all policy, and we need to acquire knowledge on that. As for awareness, it is another point that has been let's say, raised in this discussion. There is sometimes little awareness among us, among scholars, about the benefits, the real benefits of making open data. Now, if I tell you that you have to be, let's say, sincere among us, everyone as a scholar, I say, I don't want to make my data open because I'm afraid that someone publishes with this data before than me. I think that everyone has had this kind of fear. But this is we are here in the realm of misconceptions, actually, because well-stored data are also data that are safe. Data that have a persistent identifier are also data that will be properly cited. And also data that are well stored are data to which we can refer. If we receive queries, for example, during a revision process, we can refer to the repository. So this is very straightforward, but we need to increase the awareness on the benefits of open data. And finally, the rewards. Because making data open requires time, effort. I did a lot of time, so I know that. But it is very poorly rewarded. There is a lack of recognition, especially for young scholars. And I tell you my experience, again, I'm sorry to be so egocentric now, but for example, when I applied for tenure in Italy, having published the data, so having made the data as open counts basically nothing in public procedures for appointments. So What are the solutions? It seems a gloomy picture. No, I think there are some solutions, and I think there are on one side enforcement. So the policies by funding institutions like the European Commission or journals that have policies for open data. But on the other side, education. Education by funding agencies, or for example, the Italian Association for European Projects organizes a lot of courses, and don't be afraid to attend courses organized by people from other disciplines, as I did, and they are very useful because we have to learn a lot from other disciplines. And also stimulating a change in the publish or perish strategy so that creating open data might count in appointment processes. And as editor, Liz already mentioned about the continuum between flexible or stringent mandatory policies. As editors, we have to choose where to move within this continuum. I would say that it depends. And as I said before, there is no one-size-fits-all policy. So each journal should consider its own scope and aims. For instance, at EPS, it is a professional journal, but we also publish original research. But we are generalists, we are pluralists, so we welcome qualitative and quantitative, we welcome different kinds of contributions. So we should be aware of the fact that transcripts of semi-structured interviews have some privacy concerns that are not the same as anonymized survey. So probably moving towards some flexibility, so encouraging or asking authors to upload their data and their scripts, codes in a trusted repository, but at the same time to evaluate individually, case by case, whether it is the case to have an embargo or some exceptions to the rule. Also, the staff limits. Should we check as editors whether the data are correct, whether there are misuses of the data? Probably not. We are three in our team, and I don't think we can do that. But of course, if we have a trusted repository, of course the scholarly community can do that. So this is a solution. And also we have different policies across journals, very different sometimes. This is good because as I said before, there is no one-size-fits-all policy, but at the same time, I would encourage a greater dialogue among journals within, also among publishers, to have a kind of streamline, so that also as authors, we have not to handle between so many different policies. And for now, that's all. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Linda. So at this point, I guess what I want to do, we have about a half hour remaining. Leave a few minutes, maybe if we could abbreviate the original plan, a few minutes each to react and respond to each other. I saw a lot of ideas flickering in your minds. I would like to start with to give Holger and Michelangelo a chance to do so, and then anyone here, you can pass, or if you want to engage with one or another point or person, let's do that, and then that'll sort of spill off into the Q&A in just a few minutes after that. Okay, so maybe 15 minutes of us, and then 15 more minutes of the forward.
Okay. Well, actually, thank you very much for this discussion, and you raised many points. And I have two questions: one for Hajo and for Linda. Main question, comments, and I wanted to discuss with you. How do you see something that I'm interested in? First, about the coordination of data sets and integration of data. This is a major issue. I think this is a major issue with science and other disciplines. I'm very interested in that. So I like this project, and I look forward to see the developments of the project. But for example, when you say, we all know that we have, for example, different data sets on parties, and parties with different entities. And of course, this is all dependent on that. But I was wondering how we can solve this problem. Because sometimes many times data are collected So projects which are financed by different institutions or different universities, and of course all data collectors want to make their own job with that and don't. Also, they have to justify the fact that they receive money. And so, for example, or also to integrate, I study most democracies, and many times we use measurements of the level of democracy or outcomes. And we all know that there are different data sets, and just so let's even assume that we are aware of the data sets, because as you say, also sometimes we're not aware. But take just the quality for the department of the project and detail. And they are absolutely different types of measurement. So, do you think that in some way we can really integrate these things, or we should just accept that there are different types of measurements because this is science, and one could say, because which is fair for me, but the problem is that when I want to use maybe a variable from a data set, which is not in the other data set, but that variable is calculated in a way which is also dependent on another variable which I take from another. So I don't know how to solve this issue. And if to make a question again, just very okay. When you say I perfectly agree when everyone say sometimes we are jealous about this, and I would say also myself. And but I was thinking again how to solve this issue, because sometimes you receive funding. I mean, the data collection is the project, like the data. So that's fair enough. We distribute data because we do that. But sometimes we just collect data in a strictly instrumental way to publish something. In that case, I don't know how one could encourage an author to share data before doing their own research, because these data are just to reach another. And if you think that it's so bad if we share the data after publishing, of course, then maybe one never publishes, so they are lost. But yeah,
Thank you very much. Yeah. Linda, Hajo.
Yeah, I have a clear answer here. If that would count as a citation, because if I published, for example, I published 3 data sets that are open, 2 on Zenodo and another one on, but anyway, if someone cites Basile, who has done that, that would count as a publication as well. And in this case, I would not be, should not be afraid of publishing them, because that would count as thousands of citations. But if I apply for tenure in Italy and that's nothing, then I would be jealous of my data. I agree with you, because we have we need a double change. A change in the citation system, but also change in the academia. So to make that count, I think it is a cultural change. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I like citation.
Thanks for the questions. And I don't have a clear answer, but that's stuff we're working on. Regarding the party IDs, maybe a naive answer would be that in 10 years from now, the thing is so established that everyone who's starting to code parties would say, oh, well, I'm just going to use those codes because that's why should I make my own, right? So, and that would be easy for me then just to at some point chuck my data into the database, and it would be much easier. So that would be maybe a naive, but ideal kind of scenario. I think for now, what we, and that's why I try to emphasize this, for us it's important that this is not going to be a project which is imposing standards on other projects, but our goal is to say, okay, we have some of the, maybe first of all, bigger projects around and together and in cooperation and in a consensual way, we'll find agreement on how we should do these things in the future. And then, of course, you could always post harmonized data that's out there, but ideally, in future data collections, then we would. I don't like the example because it's such a simple example, but in the future we would use the same party areas. So again, maybe that's naive, but that I think should be one thing which such an infrastructure should be able to facilitate. On the other thing, sure, again, it's not going to be a project which is imposing. So there will be different measures for similar concepts around. And I think what an infrastructure then needs to do is to make people aware of the fact that there are different measures, and be, as transparent as these projects are towards what these measures actually mean, and then researchers can decide whether to pick one or the other. But to make that, finding those and maybe even enabling to assessing what's the value of the one or the other could be part of what this would be doing.
On the unique identifiers, I think of models out there. First of all, there's ISO standards. These are systems I don't know, most political scientists probably aren't too schooled in as they're coming to grad school, but country names, geographic, administrative units, I don't know, some high level things like that are already standardized. If you think about your own identity, scholarly identity, there are bodies that govern DOIs, there's bodies that govern ORCID IDs. So anyway, but those were all emergent. Now they're just part of the environment, and we just buy into it. We don't quibble too much, do we? But I don't know. There's going to be a process, and then there's going to be some probably norms, I guess, that are not saying. Holger.
Yeah. So you asked me to give an initial reaction how I responded to this. I have two things that resonated to me when I would respond to whoever wants to pick it up. I want to give so first as a starting point. So I guess looking 20 years back reminded me. We have to say I think we as political scientists we make use of the data revolution. So some PhDs they go straight into data science jobs. So also the varieties of data we deal with. So we look at the things we haven't accomplished, but I think particularly over the last 10 years, if we look back, we should also look at ourselves a little, how less technically skilled parts of us are and what we are now using. And then, but it relates, so the first thing that I responded when I responded is, if we look at these things, so one thing was implicitly, I thought many of you, this is what is labeled data literacy. And some of you refer to the technical skills that are needed, but I think I have a clear picture on the technical skills and how they are distributed within the discipline. But mainly data literacy for me, it's ethical, legal, and technical skills. And I wonder more where we are with the ethical and the legal baseline. I also, sometimes I hear that it's my data, researchers consider data as their data. And instead, I wonder if we should even be we're getting older, those on the panel, but we should be kind of normatively stronger. We are publicly funded, maybe, yes? So what is your data? What is our obligation towards science, towards the scientific process, towards our funders? Does the research interest, so does the funder have to ask us what to say that's our data? Or do we even have to start in the first year or in the first year of the master? And these data literacy elements of ethical and legal domains, maybe do we have to train it differently? Where does it come into our professional development as political scientists? That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think the panel is a very, very good presentation where the political science data ecosystem is, and Natalie reminds us of where we can improve and where it locks on. But I still wonder, this is general notion, if you read Jones or whatever, if you read federal strategies of data ecosystems, data revolutions, and I wonder how we link to other things like certain data parliaments, legislative acts, biographies of parliamentarians, whatever. So data generated, some colleagues of mine are working with imagery, satellite data. So I wonder, on the one hand, is our data, I'm not fully in the Natalie, once it is paired, it can automatically link everywhere. So, we are social scientists, these are social processes, and technology helps us and enables us, but then more may be needed that our data is linked with. And I also wonder what the data that we talked about that we want to integrate, I think we have a slight insight perspective. When is it really valuable for those working in parliaments, for those working in major newspapers? I have to work to my high school teacher who gives an introduction to populism or whatever, and what is probably currently missing, because most of it is probably publicly available or whatever, but there is something that's not as widely. So sometimes I see in the New York Times that then so the surveys use the manifesto project, but even then, so you need kind of high level, somewhat high level data science skills even to do a good descriptive analysis, and how can we make be more accessible and kind of be a visible module within a global data ecosystem or world, whatever you phrase it.
Thank you. Great. So 2 questions. One on education, one on this. Maybe we can capture one respondent to each question. I don't know. Looking at you, Natalie, or go ahead, whatever.
I mean, I'm happy to talk a little bit to the first one about the ethical and legal side. The technical side is probably for other people. Because obviously, as I mentioned, we actually did a session earlier this week looking at the ethics of data gathering. It was virtual only, but it was recorded, so it will be on the ECPR website if people want to go and watch and listen to it. And actually, one of the speakers was the editor of the European Law Journal, who of course is also a lawyer. And she did put her lawyer hat on to talk about the implications of legal aspects of data gathering. Also, there was someone talking earlier this week about in one of the data sessions about the kind of ethical and issues around researching the far right, particularly the danger that can put the researcher in, the fact that both say digital first, and all those kind of things. So talking about the kind of ethical and legal side of things, I think that there's a growing list of resources such as the open data but there is, because of this kind of question of ethicality, legality in relation to open data, the fact that needs to be built in, and the fact that that needs to be built in from the very beginning. As was mentioned earlier, though, there is this kind of continuum. There are still some aspects which is like in which authors may not be able to reveal their research. I think someone that also in relation to one of my judges mentioned that they work in defence, just they're just not able to do that. I think there is a big gap in relation to those ethical and legal aspects. You know, a good example, you know, we talk a lot about GDPR and that aspect of it, but I don't know if people knew that there's actually a similar one in the state of California. So, you know, you have to be very careful if you're using the data of anyone in the state of California. So that, and that's another aspect, is that the legality and ethical aspect can vary dramatically from place to place. They can vary a lot from the traditions of each region. So again, this comes back to the idea of what's not wanting to limit people, obviously creating some sort of standardization, creating some kind of clear guidelines and resources is really, really important. Obviously, I think a lot of publishers do have some basic guidelines, some support. Obviously, if something did come up legally wise, a lot of publishers would jump in and help. And actually, I've had 2 journals who in the last few months have both received, have been, I guess, singled out in relation to data they published by right-wing news outlets. And we've been working with them to try to make sure that that's fine. In both cases, it's absolutely fine. Our legal teams go over it, no problems. But there are these things to be aware of. So I think it is about standardization. It is about bringing that in. It is about kind of utilizing those resources and kind of and having that education, having these sessions. And I think I understand that a lot of researchers are like, I don't want to have to go to a session to learn about ethics and legality around data. I just want to do the data and I just want to get it. I want to do my work. But again, as it's becoming more open, this is becoming more important because, you know, people are being able to do it. Some people are using replication studies to attack people, which is not what they should be for. But that is happening. So yeah, I think the standardization and the move towards more education, having more sessions like this and conversations like this, really, really important. Thanks.
Perhaps I can just add to what was just being said. I love the fact that Holger brought up the issue of ethical and legal implications of data sharing, because I think that's such an important, perhaps soft but still important factor that's a constraint on actual practices of data sharing. But if in doubt, a social scientist will perhaps lean towards not publishing their data if they're not perfectly clear on the safety of them sharing their data. Right? And that's often the case. In the one of the examples I showed you there of the web scrape data, well, that's just a high-level descriptive overview of the kind of web scraping we did there. We would not be, at least with good conscience, be in a position to share the actual data that we scraped there, right? Because that's a major problem. So, of course, I think training is an answer for sure. Support, I love that you brought that up. It's an answer, absolutely. I think also what we need to keep in mind in addition to those two things is that perhaps there is a mission there for our professional associations, the academic associations, to lobby on behalf of social scientists and social research against those people whose rights we may currently be in a position to infringe or may sue us if things go really bad. Right, so we need, and that's all the people who make the rules, right? Lawmakers, companies as well. If you think of social media companies, for example, and the kind of access restrictions on the data, the important social science data they hold, they've imposed. I think there is a lot for our associations to do on our behalf in that regard. So perhaps if someone from ECPR is so listening in, that's something to consider going forward, much more than I think has been the case so far.
Excellent. Any other responses to?
I have a few quick responses.
Yeah.
One of them is related to researchers concerned about scooping. The number of people who report being worried about scooping when they decide whether to share their data doesn't change very much. Wiley had a survey that they updated in 2019. The number went from 22% to 23% from when they had done it, 2016 or something. State of Open Data, same thing. They asked researchers a similar question. Only 20% were worried about scooping. It's really not the thing that prevents us from going there, from sharing data. It is more of a factor for early career researchers, depending on their university's tenure and promotion guidelines. Fairsharing.org is an example of a platform that supports and informs interoperability. Its governance and tech could be an example for Meta. It's quite transparent in the way it operates, and there's a lot for us all to learn from fairsharing.org or even reuse. Fair-dom.org is a consortium example, and a primarily European and UK consortium example of sharing code, data, and practices. It itself could be an example for ECPR. That's fair-dom.org. And when we talk about how do we get from here to fair, I think you had some conversation about deciding what is the standard for a party, for example. The Go Fair office simplifies this into a 3-point verification process from a workshop where a discipline gets together and argues about which ID or standard for parties, to a fair implementation profile, a definition of that decision, to a fair data object. What is a fair data object in political science for party politics? That's a vast simplification, but that 3-point verification process is something the discipline, the journal, Meta can go through to get there, and they have resources to support you in getting there and make your research more attractive to funders and more interoperable across nations. So really recommend it.
I mean, we can't be the first community to argue about concepts.
No. But as human beings, that's where we go first, because we're trying to understand each other, crosswalk our data, harmonize our data. That process that happens in the workshop is really vital to community acceptance, similar to community acceptance of what is a data management plan. And what is the meaning of a good data management plan in political science? That's an ever-evolving discussion in political science, not just for one data curator, but for the discipline.
Okay, we should take a look. Let's reserve the last 10 or so minutes here for questions from the audience, including our online audience. Some of my students are here. Okay. Whatever your name. And I think we have to deal with microphones, so we have to repeat the question perhaps. What's it?
Okay, thank you very much for a really interesting panel. My name is Michelangelo. I'm from Universität, Sweden. And I really appreciate this broader focus that was present, especially in a couple of the presentations, including also qualitative data in this discussion. However, having said that, I think that the tradition among discussing standardization and sharing data is a tradition that is not really found in qualitative studies, but there is actually a privilege here when it comes to quantitative studies because you guys have been doing that for such a long time. Also, even the terminology around data and how we think about data. For me, for example, as a scholar has been working with interviews for many, many years, I see my data as produced together with the people I'm interviewing, for example. So there's also different technologies, and I wouldn't maybe use the word data all the time. So now to my question, how could we then create standards that don't privilege specific forms of data, say qualitative data, instead of kind of opening up, instead of bringing the quality people into the quantitative discourse? How do we open up to actually maybe create new forms of thinking about standards and data that don't depart from the methods that has been doing this for a long time? Thank you.
Let's gather. This is great question. Let's gather two more. Can we do that? And then, yes.
I will just be a half, not a full one, but just to say I completely agree with the previous question. That's exactly what's going on.
Yes, I also endorse Nali's question. I'm Emilia Palman. I'm also a PhD from Finland and Rinke is a program director at the University of Helsinki. And IPSA, head of publication committee at the IPSA Executive Committee, organizing this open access conference in just 2 weeks. In Montreal, pretty upset. So you could be there at least following this discussion. I wanted to talk about like this ethics and data and a little bit deeper into this possibility of like what are the negative consequences also opening up all the data and enabling like for instance these radical right forces to research for us or censor our research in terms of like the lack of ethics that have been applied. And then I would like to ask specifically, why is the PBY not open access term? It would be really a wonderful resource globally, but it's behind paywalls, even if the information would be really practical for all the journalists and general public and scholars to access.
Thanks. Okay. Let's take these two that are really early questions.
I can go to the second one, if that's okay.
Okay, let's make it.
Yeah, so first of all, I am going to be, not in person, but I am talking at the IPSA conference virtually, so I will be there in spirit. And so talking about some of the negative consequences of opening data, I mean, obviously you kind of picked up on some of the examples that I kind of gave, and that has happened. The one thing I would note though is that we have had people pick up on articles, so even without data, even with them being behind tables, they get picked up. We have on occasion had to write to editors and be like, this is a flag, someone's picked up at your article, it's being tweeted, it's not being tweeted in the way that you would want it to be. Just to let them know, very rarely has that escalated. As I said, the last 2 times, we have seen a little bit of escalation. In one of them, they've taken it a bit, potentially a bit too far. But with the other one, it was, and actually it was the European Law Journal, for instance, about it very openly in the ethics session that we did earlier this week. You know, that a Hungarian right-wing newspaper, which was attacked on the journal, she very quickly kind of asserted the journal's support for the authors, and she included, she addressed it in her editorial, which our legal team, the wider legal team, read to ensure that, you know, not libelous, and that's been included. And so, you know, we had that structure in place. She let us know, and we worked towards that. And of course, there is the integrity, there is COPE, and there is the Committee on Publishing Ethics, anyone who does. And of course, Wiley and every other publisher has their own kind of ethics and integrity publishing group, which is there to support authors, editors, etc., and the journal managers. I think, yeah.
I'd like to talk about the qualitative data question, if we can. Does anybody want to jump in first, or?
Yeah, I could say something just because I brought up the issue, so I feel like I should respond to this. I mean, obviously, as hopefully has become clear from my short presentation, that I'm fully on board with you, and I'm very concerned about this conversation being one that's exclusionary in nature. And I think there's, in fact, for us as political scientists, this is an opportunity to learn from past experience, looking at, in particular, at the experience with DART, right? I'm sure most of you are familiar with DART, right? So the Data Access and Research Transparency Initiative, it's almost 10 years old now. I think it came up in 2014, which was sort of implemented in a manner that I think was less than ideal, because it really was perceived to be, perhaps it even was, as an imposition from the dominant quantitative corners of the discipline, right? And only a couple of years later, after an extended sort of soul-searching exercise within the various sections of APSA, was there real opportunity for concerns from interpretivist scholars, qualitative scholars more generally, and so on, to air their concerns around the implications of that policy for their own work and their ability to get published, essentially, and to do the work that they do in the venues they would rightfully claim to be a part of, right? So I think there's an opportunity for us to do things differently going forward, and even without knowing precisely, of course, what that should mean, I will say that what it should mean in general is that we should have a conversation, again, as I said, hopefully an institutionalized long-term conversation within our associations that's truly open, that's truly equal, including those various methodological and epistemological points of view. And that's where I also look at sort of people coming to this from a perhaps more skeptical qualitative point of view. That's sort of broadly positive and cooperative in nature, right? And not antagonistic. I think we need to be careful to frame that conversation really in those terms in order to avoid the mistakes of the past. I hear there's a strong skepticism with you on that, Martin, but I do hope I would hope that an association like ECPR or APSA and others as well would be able to create a conversation that would sort of alleviate those concerns and really engage sort of in good faith across those boundaries. So whatever that might mean in practice, I sure hope that that's the direction we are going.
Thank you, Eike. Anybody else want to add? You know, I think of this, I work in an interdisciplinary school. I have anthropologists and ethnographers on one side, economists on another, and computer scientists, and I feel myself to be a pluralist, and I want to instigate, we must instigate as a discipline, broad conversation. So just seconded this, One of the things, I guess, I don't know enough about it. It's just too far outside my terrain to really be able to say much, but I know that I want to honor the work of the authors of my chapters, of my colleagues who are doing interviews and non-interviews and whatever other kinds of qualitative work. And, one way to do that is, I guess the question that comes to my mind is like, what are the implications of all this stuff? Like, it's certainly not to break down an interview into like variables and concepts and give them each a digital identifier. But the metadata associated maybe with some of these things, if they can be identified and whatever, I don't know how to do it, but I want to talk about it. That's all I can say, I guess, personally, representing no one but myself. And so I come on.
Yeah, but I just think that if we kind of, and thank you for your answer, I just think that if we can acknowledge that this is a problem, and that there is a privilege here going on, and that is a good starting point, because I think sometimes, I also am the chair of the Committee of Humanities and Social Sciences for the Swedish Research Council, and we have the same problem when we are talking about infrastructure within the Research Council. Because then suddenly, whatever we do in social science is not concerned as infrastructure, because that's what medicine, science, so does. And I can see kind of the same pattern kind of replicates within our discipline also. And I think, and I really appreciate this conversation, and I think it's important. I'm one of the, I think Elizabeth said, one of the more skeptical people here, but I also see the good things about actually sharing data, and I would like to be a part of that. But I don't think that we need to, taking in all the experience we have, but at the same time, kind of start from scratch and say, well, this is the situation. And we are, of course, minor. We are much, this is a discipline dominated by quantitative studies, so that's fine. I've chosen to be here. But there is also, mutual respect here, and I think I find this in this panel. So I just, thank you for answering this.
And I'm trying to personalize this, but I think we have to think quite explicitly about this privilege, the representation, and I was, as we put this together, we were thinking about representation of diverse, but perhaps this is the point on which we, could have done better. A sixth panelist to not make it a Q&A after the fact, but really right here. Thank you everybody. I think we have to end at that, but we'll be around for private conversation. Thanks.